So welcome to today's Hardman Talks. My name is Brian Moretta. I'm head of tax advanced services and host of the EIS Navigator podcast. And today I am joined by Sunil Shah, who is managing partner at O2 Ventures. Welcome to the Hardman Talks.
Thank you. Good to be here.
It would be good to get an idea of what O2H is and does. So maybe we can start there.
Yep. So O2H is a group company, and we have some three areas where we focus on, really all around biotechnology. So one is we have a drug discovery research services company with around 350 professional scientists employed in the biology and chemistry space, and we support lots of biotech and pharma around the world. Secondly, we have this building that we're in now, and a 2.7 acre plot in Cambridge, where we are developing a science park around biotechnology, and we have the first building live. It's a grade 2 listed building where I'm in now. We've just redeveloped that recently. And we have other buildings on the site where we're going to develop. We're just next door to AstraZeneca, very near the Addenbrooke site and fairly central. And the third area is we have a fund, a knowledge intensive and an SCIS fund where we invest into early stage biotech. So that's what we're here to talk about today. And that's an area where I run.
Yeah, so I thought it might be helpful to go back to basics a little bit for people. I mean, I'm sure everyone is vaguely aware to some extent of drug and drug discovery. I think we've all seen what's happened with vaccines over the last couple of years, and everything's become more important. But I thought it might be good if you could give an overview of how sort of drug discovery processes work, particularly at the early stages, because I think if we understand those, we understand how you can invest in them. Yeah,
I think a little bit of backdrop is that, over the last 10 or 15 years, big pharma have been closing down R&D, and they would like to acquire and license or do some kind of option deal much earlier than they're ever used to, because they need to acquire that innovation. That's why we got more interest in space, apart from sort of having our sort of fingers or networks across the industry for many years. But we started investing really on that sort of investment hypothesis. And we've invested in around 25 biotech companies, and we split the area into sort of three buckets. So there's a typical drug discovery, which you mentioned, where you are doing preclinical research, often a university spent out with maybe 10 or 15 years of research work that's gone on in a particular drug target, an oncology target, or neurosciences, Alzheimer's, or other therapeutic areas. And then that spins out, and then the company will work on developing that science into an industrial project and hopefully into a drug. And along the way, you're sort of collecting data, and that data becomes more and more valuable if the data is positive, essentially. So really,
those are kind of like the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials that we hear everyone talking about.
Yeah, I mean, essentially you're a data collector. Although it's called a biotech, really you're about collecting data. And the more data you collect around your drug, the more likely it is to work and get approved in humans, and the value it creates then, not only in treating patients, but obviously there's that value in the drug. And that's the area we focus on. And I think it's a very interesting area, more so than, say, a number of years ago, where people focus on the long time horizons, is that there are a number of exit points along the way when you develop a drug. And many companies exit even before you go into clinical trials, during clinical trials. Obviously, you can actually create sales and revenues, but most biotechs are looking to exit or raise funding during that process. And so there are opportunities as secondaries or acquisitions from big pharma, which is where we really focus.
So how long does it actually take to develop a drug these days? And is that changing?
Well, it takes 10 to 12 years or so to develop a drug to actually make it through clinical trials and through to patients. And a lot of the areas where the investment's going into is into where that tech meets biotech, which we also invest into. And that technology is trying to shortcut that process by either finding more druggable targets or validating drug targets better before a drug discovery process can start, or sort of leapfrogging in that early preclinical stage by finding high quality chemical matter much earlier. So maybe you can shave a number of years off in that early phase. And that's the area that we focus on. But with AI, machine learning, quantum are all technologies which are trying to shortcut that area, which is the second area we invest into. And there's one more, which is in the service space, where we can develop services to support biotech and pharma. So they're the three buckets we invest in. So typical biotech therapeutics, AI, machine learning, meets biotechnology and services.
So I'm sure the idea of applying machine learning in this area will be new to a lot of people. Oh, without getting technical, can you maybe explain how that might work? How AI could maybe help this process?
In multiple different ways. Human biology is complicated, and computing power can help understand how different pathways in the body can interact with each other and therefore identify better targets. Computing power can try to understand all the literature available, the hordes of information that's already out there, try to analyze that and try to come up with more advanced start points. There are a number of ways that you can use AI machine learning to advance drug discovery, and that's why a lot of the large tech companies are really, really interested in this space. So a lot of the funding at the later phases is not only coming from biotech, typical traditional firms, but a lot of the technology firms are really interested in this space to try to really shortcut that process, but using various different quantum AI machine learning technologies.
And is that kind of at the early stages, do you think, of applying that, or are we sort of, are we already seeing a lot of benefits from it?
We're definitely seeing that starting to come through. Many of the projects now start with some kind of computing technology to find start points. Typically, a number of years back, big pharma were the only real companies that could start projects, because they would do something like a high throughput screen, which costs a lot of money, and you need millions of libraries in vials, and you basically screen a drug target against all these millions of compounds physically. Now, a lot of that can be done through computers. People still use high throughput screening, but computing power is sort of given early stage biotech companies another option to try to find ways of starting projects and programs. So it's definitely happening, and there's huge amounts of money coming in that particular area.
Yeah, you would have thought if AI can, even if it lops a few months or a year off a drug development process, that is, going to save a huge amount of money.
It's actually a really good question. I was on a meeting with other investors in a startup that we invested into. We're one of the few biotech funds in that one, but the other funds are sort of technology funds. And we're having this call around this company's drug pipeline, and they're going for a larger fundraise from other tech VCs. And they're on the course, and I'm saying, I've looked at their pipeline. I'm saying, that pipeline that you're looking to create is bigger than GSK's or Pfizer. And they're like, so you're a dinosaur. We're going to press a bunch of buttons and we're going to come up with loads. And it's like, and I'm thinking, am I the dinosaur here? So am I just not thinking that technology can actually do this? And the tech guys come and look at this problem and say, this is how we're going to do it. So it's a very, very different mindset to the typical biotech, because we think of a long process and generating data along the way. But they are thinking, yeah, why not have 30 programs running simultaneously? Because it's only computing power. So it's going to be an interesting few years, I think, on the back of it.
Yeah, do you think there's a danger then that we almost end up with almost more candidates than we can handle, in the sense that you could get the AI sort of developing all these things as candidates, and then we've got to actually say which one's the most promising?
Another great question, because ultimately, even if you come up with these candidates, you've got to process them, and ultimately, big pharma buy drugs. We need drugs, not computers and bytes. So we, to sort of discover and develop and put that many projects through clinical trial is a huge effort, and obviously very costly. So when I look at something like that, I try to rein it in a little bit. Let's focus. But I think that's the interesting space where biotech and tech funds are working together to try and solve some of these issues. And we're coming from different directions, but I think when you've got both together, it's a really interesting investment.
Yeah, it seems to me that AI could be one of these things that could make it almost. It sounds like it could almost make a step change in the industry, and certainly a complete revolution of the way it works.
Well, there's a number of AI-driven biotech companies which started off with the pure AI and then became more and more biotech as they went along. So you had that kind of nice mix. And there's ones that you probably have heard of, like Sentia and Benevolent and companies like that. But there are a number of other companies coming on behind that, and they're the ones we're trying to sort of pick off.
So you mentioned earlier about sort of a lot of your companies are kind of spin-offs. Is that kind of the typical way a lot of these things start, where there's an academic or an academic lab that sort of gets an idea, and then they sort of say, well, actually, this might commercialize?
Yeah, I mean,
and does AI change that?
Yeah, a lot of these projects start at that at that sort of level where there's been a body of research undergone by a PI or an academic in a university in Cambridge, Oxford, Nottingham, Sussex, wherever. And you have to spin the science out, develop the intellectual property strategy, and check what was done in academia works in industry and try to industrialize that science. So that's kind of the process of spin out. So it's quite a long and slow process somewhat. And it takes maybe 1 or 2 years to do some of these spin outs of finding the opportunities and then working through that. So it's not something that we're very quick at, but I think we are definitely getting better at that. Without a doubt, AI or machine learning or quantum will help some of those projects get started. Most of those projects rely on computational technology to really help them along the way and to try to shortcut the process. But that's typically how something starts. And they may have an Innovate UK award or a grant. So there's quite a lot of soft money available for biotech, and the government's been very supportive in a number of different ways to try to get these technologies through to patients.
Presumably AI can also affect the risk profile in one sense, in that a lot, if I think back to the early days when I started, I've never looked at the biotech very hard, but when I was a fund manager, I saw a few coming through my colleagues, and a lot of them had a drug or a candidate that looked very promising. And you always, and it always felt like hero or zero a little bit. Whereas I know from speaking before, you're not keen on the hero or zero. You're keen on companies that have got a potential portfolio or suite or related compounds. Does AI make it more likely that people can have sort of a range of options than having, okay, here's this one prime candidate? I
think companies that have a platform, whether it's an AI machine learning platform or some kind of platform entrenched in a deep knowledge around the biology around a particular space, and therefore can have multiple products coming off them, are generally more valuable. And obviously you're not then betting on one particular project failing or succeeding. So we have those in the portfolio as well, and we've got a couple that may read out hopefully positively this year. But it's to get those more platform companies funded and developed is definitely more interesting, and can mitigate some of the risk of moving forward. A lot of the big US VCs like those platform companies, and therefore you're more likely to get funding in the sort of the Series A's and Series B's as well. And obviously, if you go for a listing or an IPO, having a platform company can really help as well, because you don't really want to go to a listing or an AIM or a London Stock Exchange or NASDAQ with one drug, because that would be very difficult if it didn't work. But where the O2H works, we have a portfolio of things anyway at all times. So, so hopefully we've mitigated the risk across the portfolio. Does
future funding actually figure in your thinking about companies? Because it seems to me that if a drug development company in particular has got something that's kind of working, they're going to get funding. And that's the kind of the way the environment feels to me. So is the availability of future funding something you think about hard, or is it something that's just like, okay, if it works, we'll get it?
Future funding is really key. So even when you're developing great science, some of those companies don't raise funding. So we're always thinking of, can the CEO or the CEO that we appoint sometimes when they spin out, are they able to raise money, and do they have those connections? And if you put them in front of the right investors, are they able to pitch appropriately? Because raising money is absolutely key to our sector. And you in that pre-seed seed stage where we invest, you're kind of street fighting to try to get to a Series A. And if you get to a Series A, then all the international capital comes in, and there's a huge wall of money in biotech at the Series A and beyond. I think at that pre-seed seed phase, you have to make the business look right, develop the science, industrialize it, de-risk it as much as possible to try and get a Series A away. And I think that's where the international money comes in. Even before COVID, the biotech funds were raising, the larger VCs were raising significant capital for that Series A and beyond. During COVID, I've never seen so many new funds appear everywhere. And I think the US is somewhat saturated with money, and they are definitely looking into the UK to invest in Series A and beyond. They find it difficult to invest in the pre-seed seed. So you sort of have to make it through that stage. But if you do get to a Series A, you can see significant uplifts in the valuation between this pre-seed seed and the Series A, and they can raise a significant quantum of cash.
So why is the pre-seed seed stage harder for them, do you think?
I think you need more hand-holding and more support to the early stage biotechs, and it's at that stage you're sorting out the IP, you're making sure the management is developing in the right direction, you're de-risking the asset maybe by doing some few key experiments, and then after that they feel, okay, I feel more comfortable now, and it's more developed. They can assess the risk of it more easily without having to be within the company or sort of having daily contact with the company. So I think as a pre-seed seed fund, we're constantly in touch with all the biotechs. Some of them are in this building. We're in the boards of several of them, and I think that hand-holding or that support you give them at that early stage, it could be a contact in industry, it could be a commercial partner, it could be a scientific technical person that can really support and help the science. So in all different ways you can support and help, and I think if you can get them through that phase, then there is definitely significant uplift we have in the Series A. But that's a bit that we focus on within the fund. And
the other thing that I kind of hear people talking about a little bit in these sort of areas is the difficulty of doing diligence, because it seems to me this is an area that's very, very technical in one sense, and you as an investor have to almost make a probabilistic statement. So, okay, they've got whatever platform or whatever suite of candidates that they've got, and you have to make an assessment of how likely these are to be successful. How do you go about diligencing these sort of companies?
Well, we have an in-house team that can support and help with the due diligence, but often with these kind of more therapeutic approaches, there's key experts around the world, and you often have to reach out through your network because it may be a specific area of cancer biology that you want to, and so you have to sort of use your network, I think, to help DD. But it is quite technical DD, and that's the problem. That's why most other funds early stage find it difficult to invest in this area, mainly because of the technical DD. Once we get through our technical due diligence, often we're able to talk to other investors, other funds, and they can often invest behind our technical pack of information. So we do help get a lot of these things funded. We do lead a lot of our investments that we go into. And that's partly due to the technical due diligence. The early stage seed funds probably don't have the in-house technical capability to or the network to lead those. I think that's, when they get to a Series A, a lot of maybe the technical information is a little bit more developed, and therefore it's easier to do DD on. But therefore at the Series A, there are, and the Series A funds, those larger funds, they've raised significant capital, hundreds of millions, and they're able to employ the right caliber of team to be able to do the technical DD. I think we have those people in the team already, just really because of the ecosystem I described earlier.
So Series A, are we typically talking about, you've got a lot of lab data, phase 1 data? What sort of stage of development does a company usually have at Series A?
It does vary. I would say probably 18 months before the clinic, or commercial traction, and good preclinical data, or it could be phase 1, phase 2 data. So it sort of varies in between. Okay. We've got a company, we've got company at all those ranges, and yeah, there is. I think the Series A's are getting earlier and bigger, but that's partly due to the wall of money out there. Yeah. But in the old days, it was probably a phase 2 clinical trial, and now it's very much preclinical, high quality data, good team, and a path that you can see going through the clinic.
Yeah, the risk of asking an impossible question. Do you think we see, obviously, a lot of flowing, not just into this area, but across the private markets? I think over the last sort of couple of years, we've had a lot of quantitative easing, whatever. Notwithstanding what's happening in Ukraine, we seem to have turned and we're in a tighter environment, or heading into a tightening environment. Do you think there will be, think that'll affect the flow of money going into this area?
Brian, that's a highly pertinent question. I think we need to address this head on. I mean, we have seen the NASDAQ come off significantly, where a lot of the biotechs are listed at very high valuations, and they did very well over the lockdown period. I think that what's happened in COVID is that people now understand a little bit more about biotechnology than they did earlier, and a lot more actually. And I think the difference between, say, a technology and a biotechnology is that often these things, the technology things on NASDAQ are maybe app driven, and you can switch off one app and put on another, and you can turn off Facebook, and my kids turn on Insta and Snapchat, and suddenly the users go from one to the other. It's quite, I would say it's easy to switch because you've got data, but it's switchable. Whereas with biotech, you're developing real products that are going to be used by patients for many years with an IP position. I think people now understand that. And I have seen biotech sort of fare starting to recover on the NASDAQ for those reasons. Secondly, most of the investment that will come into biotech at that Series A come from funds with 10 to 12 year time horizons. And most of them topped up over the COVID period because of the awareness of biotech. And so they have a 2-3 investing period. So I don't know whether it's luck or timing or whatever it is, but a lot of our companies are having very good, significant discussions around the Series A, and a number of them already raised their funds. How the war affects all of that, I think emotionally it's very difficult for all of us to watch the news, but on an economic front, I think we're going to continue as business as usual. But it's obviously you can't have a conversation around this and what's going on in the world without with children being very emotional and watching what's going on the TV. But I think economically, we're going to be okay.
Yeah, I think I've seen a few things recently about stock market and how geopolitical events don't affect stock market as much as you might think.
Yeah, and we can see the stock market starting to sort of come back a bit now, and whether it continues, who knows what goes on. But
so we've spoken in generalities. I thought it might be good to get a couple of specifics in terms of at various times I get the impression that various areas are more or less attractive. What areas do you see as particularly attractive right now? And maybe talk about why they've become attractive in layman's terms, please.
I think the rare and orphan disease have always been sort of fairly attractive because of the shorter clinical trials and the lower cost to developing products. So I think that backdrop is always there, and it's always interesting to try to get product to market more quickly and more cost effectively.
So maybe explain what those are.
Oh, just anything with a very small patient population. So the government think, well, the cost of development is so high for some of these rare and orphan diseases that they will fast track you through a clinical trial. You maybe need fewer numbers of patients to develop those products. And there's lots and lots of these rare and orphan diseases. An area of high interest is the psychedelic drugs. I mean, there is significant body of evidence that psychedelics can support and help patients with clinical highly depressive patients, clinically depressive patients, severe depressed patients. And we have 3 companies in the portfolio working in that space. One is going through a phase 2 clinical trial. And if that's successful, I'm sure that will do very well moving forward. So I think that's another area of interest. Oncology and neuroscience is always it's of high demand. A lot of the deals that are done in biotech, the significant proportion of deals done in the biotech space are within the cancer oncology space. So most biotechs proportionally are on the oncology side. So
and is that because there's lots of promising drugs out there, or is that because there's a lot of funding? It seems to me that's an area that always is particularly well funded.
It is well funded, but there's obviously a high unmet need in a number of cancers still. Pancreatic, glioblastoma, another number of and cancers are not treated well at all. So there are, and we understand more about cancer than we ever have done, obviously, with all the body of evidence of research. So so there's a lot of investment going into that space, and that's always an area of our interest. And whereas immune oncology or other areas within that space that is an area of interest. Alzheimer's is really sort of a neuroscience is coming back into vogue somewhat, because I think again we're understanding more about Alzheimer's and the body around that, and the huge unmet need in that area. So there are a number of areas which I think are highly interesting for biotechs. It's anything which often there's some niche indications where everybody and their dog is not working on. Sometimes we look at those, and so sometimes we get different indications in the oncology or the typical Alzheimer's where we think we can make a difference.
I think it's interesting, because we had this drug last year that was kind of approved in the States. There was some debate about its effectiveness, but I think the one thing that came through from that is that there's a desperate willingness, whatever, for something for Alzheimer's, because we don't seem to have very much at all at the moment. So even something that vaguely might work seems to be like, okay, people are jumping at it.
Yeah, I mean, but the clinical trials are obviously very long and they're very expensive. But there is, a significant unmet need there. So you are looking at platforms and technologies that can support and help there. And as a small fund, we've got to tread very carefully.
Yeah, it seems to me, yeah, as you say, it's a difficult area because it's not like we know what works, or the impression I get even the process of Alzheimer's itself is not well understood.
But you make all these are really, I mean, we're lucky that we're able to invest and hopefully sort of create a return for ourselves, but B, we can make a significant difference to these patients. So I think everyone who works in space just feels, very, very lucky that we're able to do, tick 2 boxes in our lives. And I think I'm one of them.
Yeah, obviously having the sort of ethical side of things, I think, is something that people really appreciate being involved in these days. So the final topic I wanted to cover today was talking about knowledge-intensive approved funds, which is kind of this, I would call it this niche area of EIS. They're actually becoming incredibly popular. You were the first people to actually get a knowledge-intensive fund approved. So I thought it would be good to sort of quickly chat about what these are and how these work. So maybe we start with the basics again. What is a knowledge-intensive company? So
knowledge-intensive company by HMRC have to sort of meet certain criteria, but significantly it's about investing a large portion of your money back into research and development, IP development. And being as we invest in the biotech space, pretty much everything we do is knowledge intensive. So it made sense for us to apply to become a knowledge intensive firm. So we were following the legislation as it was going through Parliament, which all got delayed during the COVID lockdown. But as soon as it got approved, all our paper was pre-filled, and we couldn't wait to do that. But to answer the question specifically, knowledge intensive funds can only invest in R&D driven businesses essentially.
And I think it's probably fairly obvious, but why would the government want to support these?
As we're trying to come out of Brexit through lockdown, I think all this legislation was put into place before COVID actually. But through Brexit, there are certain areas where UK punches well above its weight, but it's significantly underfunded. And we have such a great scientific base in the UK. And if I compare to the US, which I go there quite a bit because that's where a lot of the biotech are based in Boston, San Francisco. If I compare to there, I would say our scientists are equally as good as the scientists in the US, but the funding that they get into their biotechs at early stages off the scale compared to what we have in the UK. And if we could fill that gap, we could really create those high-paying jobs which the government really want. And that's why, and the amount of money that comes into these biotech companies, when you do a Series A, we haven't mentioned the quantum, but some of these Series A can be 15, 20, 50, 100, $200 million in size. And so that could be funding coming outside of the UK into the UK and creating and developing our scientific base. And it's the one area where we punch way above our weight. And that's why the government has really tried to support the biotech industry. Coming out of Brexit, we've got to work on our strengths, and that's a strength.
Yeah, and I think, it's kind of interesting. I mean, there's definitely geographical areas. You're based in Cambridge, as you sort of said, and that does seem to be one of the centers for this.
Yeah, I mean, there's a really good cluster and hub in the Cambridge area. Having said that, we don't just invest in Cambridge. Maybe half our things are in Cambridge, half our companies, but there are good scientific bases outside of the UK, outside of Cambridge as well. But I would say clusters are really helpful and supportive in biotech. There are a lot of moving parts, whether it's IP, lawyers, and clinical houses, etc. And having people like in a building like this, we have 2 or 3 of our companies downstairs over coffee chatting to each other. Oh, do you know that person in MIT that does that? Oh, I can make an introduction. Those little chance conversations is what's really helped the clusters in San Fran and Boston. The US have worked that out. They are really focused on their clusters in biotech, and I think that's why I think, and having AstraZeneca as our neighbors, it's really quite supportive to the ecosystem here.
Yeah. So coming back to approved funds, what are the advantages for investors of the approved fund? Because it places some restrictions on you in terms of you've got to invest quite quickly, or well, not quite quickly, but you've got to invest within certain timescales. But what's the benefits for investors?
Well, just on that benefit for investors, but I'll come back to the timescales because it's actually the reverse. But the benefits for investors, they're able to understand which year they can claim their relief in. So if they invested, we have a closing on the 6th of April. If they invest on the 5th of April, they in 2021, 2022 tax year, they can claim their relief in 2021, 2022, or 2019, 2020, even if we invest in the future, as long as we meet certain criteria, i.e. investing in knowledge intensive funds. 90% of the money has to go into KI defined businesses, and we have to invest in like a 2-year time frame. So it's a really quite a long time frame. We typically invest everything within a year. So and the reason why, and there are other advantages from, they can put a larger quantity to work. I think the significant advantage for most investors is that they have security of knowing, no matter when I deploy it within certain reason, they know which time they're going to get their tax and then tax relief in. The advantage for us as a fund manager is, before I had KI relief, and I'm an entrepreneur by background, I was kind of into the fund management space. And it got to March 31st, and I had all these IFAs saying, we need to have our money invested by the 5th of April because we're investing for the tax and we need to get the relief. And it's such a huge amount of pressure to do all your deals before the 5th of April, that even if you find out when you're trying to make an investment that, and during you do due diligence until you put your money in the company. That's how it works. Even if you found something out during that due diligence process at the very end, you'd almost feel obliged to put your money in because everyone's going to lose their tax relief. So I had like a sleepless nights, in the first year we did this, because I'm like, I don't feel quite comfortable. I haven't even worked out the option pool with that company yet. Or in DD, I'm just not quite sure. One of my technical guys has come back and they have some question marks here. And you just have to take the leap of faith almost. And now with the knowledge intensive fund, if I invest on April the 5th or April the 8th, it makes no difference to anyone at all, really. So I've taken that. I think we'll make better, higher quality investment decisions, not based on tax, but based on the businesses. And I think that's what the EIS industry really needs to do, is to focus less on the tax. We all want the tax relief. It's amazing tax reliefs, but to invest into the businesses for the right reason, and hopefully we'll make better informed investments and more diligence investments on that basis. So I think that's the advantage for us and the investor. There is I think that sums it up.
Yes, it's interesting you come back to about making better investments, because I think something that sometimes gets lost in this industry a little bit is, as you say, we end up focusing on the tax a little bit too much. And so I did my white paper last year on putting the investment case at the forefront of why people should be investing in EIS just venture capital on principle, even without the tax breaks. But yeah, the tax breaks are actually absolutely immense.
I mean, the tax breaks are amazing, and I think it's sort of the jealousy of the world that we were able to do this. I mean, the US pile money in through other means into their startups. But we have EIS, and long may it continue. There is a limit to how long the government may continue with it, because obviously they need to fill up. They may have other things they need to do in the treasury, but I think it's really, really important for that early stage ecosystem that they keep it. But until 2025, it's definitely in play, and I think it's obviously, hopefully, very likely that will continue after that. And I think the early stage, especially in biotech, we really needed to get going. So many of our companies start through an EIS mechanism, and then continue to grow through other mechanisms. But it's just that early stage pre-seed, seed rounds. The EIS is really important for biotech because it is risky, and having the loss relief in place, having the IHT relief for 2 years, having the capital gains tax-free elements of it. I think all these things are really, really important and are really helpful to our sector.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that there's more money coming in because of this than there would be otherwise. And hopefully come 2025 or hopefully sooner, Mr. Sunak or whoever his successor is will say that we're keeping the scheme going, because I think it does make a big difference for all the companies involved.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of these companies, I can say, that would probably never have got started. We've got 25 in the portfolio, in the fund portfolio now. Many of them would have never got going. Most of them would have never got going without EIS. And we've led a lot of those deals. So I think we're definitely making a contribution through the generous tax schemes of EIS that the government's provided us with. We're using the tools well to get companies started. And many of those companies, I think 9 of ours are raising Series A's right now, and they're talking around 15, 20 plus million. So I think that will really benefit the economy overall, significantly outweigh the tax reliefs.
Yeah, I know we're talking about O2H, but I think that's a story I see replicated around the EIS industry, with people who've started to be around a little while and they show that they're generating value and jobs. So hopefully, as I say, that'll be enough. So if anyone wanted to find out more about what you're doing about at O2H, where should they come and find you?
Very simple. Go to o2hventures.com, and all our portfolio is is there. If you want to invest in the fund, you just click there. It's like 3-4 clicks and off you go. So it's a pure technology platform for investing, and all the IM and information there, and you can ask questions through by emailing us through that. So we're always, obviously, we have a closing on April the 5th or 6th, whatever that last day is, for the knowledge intensive fund. And if you'd like to invest, please go to the website.
Well, thank you very much for coming on today, Sunil. That's been really interesting finding out a bit more about the drug industry.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the great questions today.
And for our viewers, please don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. We appreciate your time. Please do share your comments below and hit that like button. Otherwise, we'll see you back here on Hardman Talks next time. Thanks for listening and watching.